Hello and welcome to this webinar hosted by Greenstone, where we will be looking at the value and impact of Supplier Codes of Conduct. I am Gyles Scott-Hayward, the head of SupplierPortal at Greenstone, and I'm delighted to welcome Rachel Lander and Colleen Theron as speakers on today's webinar. Rachel is Director of Teaching and Learning at the University of Westminster and is also working extensively on sustainability projects and goals for the university. Colleen is CEO of Ardea International, a partner of Greenstone and a specialist sustainability business and human rights consultancy. So both very knowledgeable on the subject we'll be tackling today, which is the effective creation and use of codes of conduct by organisations. Firstly, so we just run through the agenda. Firstly, Rachel will be providing an introduction to the Code of Conduct itself, what they typically cover and what they can achieve in terms of positive impact throughout the supply chain. I will then look at the challenges faced by organisations when implementing a Code of Conduct, from distribution and monitoring to supplier engagement and driving improvement. Colleen will then look at the legal basis of a code of conduct with regard to how it can help the organisation itself meet its legal and reporting requirements, and indeed what power it has to hold suppliers to account. Lastly, we'll have an opportunity to discuss any questions that you might have. So if you do have any questions, please enter them in the box provided in your webinar toolbox there on your screen, and do that at any point in the webinar, and we'll come to that at the end. So without any further delay, I'll pass you over to Rachel to begin her introduction of Supplier Codes of Conduct.
So there's the University of Westminster. I'm actually on site, and I'm going to be talking to you about the project from my perspective. I've put my contact details, but those, I think we'll all be sending our contact details out after the event. As Gyles said, I'll be running through sort of basic introductions and motivations for supplier codes, a little bit on definitions and usage and effectiveness. But I wanted to finish by letting you know more about the university role in the project and the white paper, and how we're using the research, particularly in my interest is in using it in learning and teaching. And as we have so many business sustainability people in the audience, I will at some stages be asking for your help. But I was going to start with just say, you know, the supplier codes of conduct are always relevant. This was from Monday. So Apple having to reprimand their supplier and threaten, I think, I haven't followed the story after Monday, but they're certainly threatening to drop Pegatron. And we know that they've had problems with Foxconn. So it's just reminding us all that these problems are they're endemic for businesses, and it's not just international. There's not just problems in countries. We've got our own homegrown example in Leicester with the scandal over Boohoo and the garment sector there, and workers' rights and infringements in that sector. So I think to remind us all about the development of codes of conduct, I mean, there was significant work that you'll see in our white paper on the United Nations work around this, but in the academic literature, it's the scandal reporting in businesses that led many businesses to more properly engage with developing codes of conduct. And so this is a snip from one research paper going back to the 90s, but the table goes on and on. And I think a lot of us know the stories. We've got the problems with Nike there, the problems with Adidas, going on to the problems with Primark, the problems with incidents in the catastrophe in the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh. And we know that these issues keep happening. So there is pressure because of the business consequences on companies to develop pretty good codes of conduct, so codes of conduct that are fit for purpose and that can be properly monitored. I think the other thing is it's very difficult to get the balance right. And I was going to illustrate this is there's some research into the most ethically perceived brands, and you've got them there by country. So there's what everyone is saying in these countries. These are the really good brands. They're getting it right, and they're really good practice. And then if you then think about perceptions of companies that have got it wrong, you have exactly the same companies appearing in the lists. So I think this reminds us that even when you develop a very good best practice code of conduct, that's not the end of the story. And that's part of what Gyles will be addressing in the issues around implementation of these codes of conduct. And it's just something to remind ourselves of that in the white paper, we can talk about, or we discuss the roots of it. We give best practice, we give examples, but in actual practice, I think there's always several challenges for companies. And the definitions, it's really, it's trying to set out the standards of behaviour expected, and that's always going to be an issue. Particularly because you're doing cross-cultural work, and you have different expectations in places, and it covers, a code of conduct in general covers not just the supply chain, but the company's relationship with all their employees, and it sets out the standards of behaviour. Practice varies. Our project was more specifically on supplier codes of conduct, and you'll find some companies have just a code of conduct and others have a separate supplement for suppliers. The thing about codes of conduct, but Colleen will be picking up on this later on, is that in themselves they are not legally binding. What they're trying to do is communicate the company values. So I've given one example I spotted there that, about doing the right thing as well as doing things right. So companies will use a code of conduct and publicize that on their website so that people can view that code of conduct to let people know what their standards are and what their values are and how they're trying to address that with their employees and with their suppliers. Usage and effectiveness. When I was thinking about this, I mean, the core thing is that for a supplier code of conduct, it's the primary tool that companies have for actually implementing the CSR, the corporate social responsibility in supply chains. And that's all about the drive to transparency in the supply chain, the drive to traceability in the supply chain so that we understand where everything comes from, and also the drive for the challenge of managing the longer supply chains. So long supply chains are typically where you'll find far more issues in actually implementing and monitoring a supplier code of conduct, although obviously they can blow up in shorter supply chains as well. In our research, we did a lot on the UN guidance around this, because this emphasises the human rights issues. And I think the white paper, we emphasise how supplier codes of conduct are used to address ensuring that human rights issues are addressed in the supply chain and that best practice is followed. However, I think we should acknowledge that environmental issues are now becoming increasingly important, and that monitoring of this, particularly pollutants in the supply chain, is going to become an issue, and it's about company behaviour here as well. So, for example, I know in one company in the fishing sector, so fish products, at one stage was shipping prawns to Thailand from Scotland, I think, and then they were processed there and then they were shipped back, so that you had an inordinate amount of food miles. But in fact, the environmental argument there was that it was more economic to do that. So it's about companies really thinking about their practice and thinking about what the appearance of the things that they're doing is, and whether that is meeting the spirit of whatever they've published in their code of conduct. So, and that's about upholding standards. So in terms of having a code of conduct, it's about ensuring that the reputation management for the company, and a good code of conduct is trying to exemplify what the organisation wants to do in terms of ethical business practice. But I think underlying that, the real issue is about that business being able to build trust across all the stakeholder groups. So that's not just the supply chain, that will reach into the consumers of the products. And I think there's a lot of pressure on companies these days. We've just had the Consumer Association, which announcing that they're now going to be ranking products specifically on sustainability. So they're integrating that into their recommendations to consumers on which products to buy, which would be quite influential for the UK, and there'll be other consumer bodies in other countries doing things similarly. I think there is also a rider on this, on the research in terms of companies publishing codes of conduct and trying to implement corporate social responsibility standards. There is research done on a number of small to medium-sized European companies, so across Europe, and that basically showed that where companies were able to report and be transparent and show that they were really trying to meet the standards they'd set themselves, they were respected. But the companies that would create corporate social responsibility standards and do that in a half-hearted way, not follow through and not report on them, they're the ones that typically would then get targeted and have suffer some sort of reputational damage. So I think that's one of the things about the codes of conduct. It's a specific thing, but it's tied up with the whole company approach to corporate social responsibility, and that is addressing the triple bottom line, the environmental, social and governance issues. The university role, just to give you the background, Colleen and I applied for some seed funding to hire some interns to work on this, and we were successful last year in doing that. But we've managed to get a little bit of further funding to produce the white paper from our dean, Malcolm Kirkup, he's another great, he's very active in sustainability, so that was really welcome. And then both Colleen and I did joint supervision of the research by the interns, so that's Hannah Purdy and Parker Roth, who are with us here today to answer any questions at the end, and we all collaborated on developing the white paper. So that's a sort of summary for the university. Background on myself for the collaboration with Ardea is I've taken a lead role in the school developing sustainability teaching. So for example, I've developed a course for undergraduates in sustainable business that I've now delivered to, well, it'll be coming on for 2,500 students soon. The business school itself is a part of the Principles of Responsible Management Education, which is another body, it's another initiative of the UN Global Compact. And if you read our white paper, you'll see the role of the UN Global Compact in developing principles that are then implemented in codes of conduct are quite pivotal. And I also have collaborated previously with Ardea on developing teaching on a postgrad module on supply chain sustainability. But what the business school is doing now, which I wanted to specifically mention to this audience, is we're working, or one of my roles is to try and embed sustainability across all the core modules. And what we're aiming to do, and this is about our students and their interest in this, is we're aiming to try and develop this so that we incorporate what we call authentic assessments for students, which really actually needs business involvement. So anyone is welcome to contact me, because what we really love to do is work with businesses to identify business challenges for students and then to set that as assessments. And we've had quite a lot of success with this, with companies coming in, both from the private sector and from the non-profit sector, and setting challenges and getting some very good ideas out of the students. So there's a sort of win-win situation there on developing sustainability. The other things that I wanted to just finish with is the how we're going to use the research in learning and teaching, because it's obviously got applications for both undergrad and postgrad, but when we originally worked on it, it was about embedding it on the undergraduate teaching. And we have just refreshed all our courses, and one of the things we're doing with the new course is for final year students, we're launching what we call a sustainability track, which is a pair of modules related to sustainability, so that they can evidence specialism in business management and sustainability, which I think is appealing for many these days. There's certainly much more interest than when I first started teaching it, when students seem to be more ignorant about basic issues such as the Sustainable Development Goals and things. And then specifically from this research, we're going to try and develop something, I thought, using the escape room concept. So the students will be set a series of challenges around code of conduct, and they won't be able to escape the room until they've completed those challenges. So I'm looking forward to working on that. We've also just launched this year a new Masters in Sustainability Management and Innovation, and those students we'll be working with them also on developing material around codes of conduct for them as well. But obviously the next steps that I know Colleen and I want to do is to extend this research, and so we're also interested in anyone in the organisation. We're looking to do some more in-depth field work with people and to understand in more depth the issues around developing, implementing and monitoring codes of conduct. So I'm going to stop there.
Okay, sorry, thank you, Rachel. That was great. A comprehensive introduction there to the codes of conduct and their objectives. And I'd encourage anyone on the call to engage with the university to have their sustainability problems solved by the students there. So now we'll look at, just once you've defined your code of conduct, how you overcome the challenges of implementing it. So just briefly about Greenstone, for those of you who are not so familiar, we provide sustainability software in over 100 countries, and this comprises 3 solutions that cover enterprise sustainability reporting against globally approved greenhouse gas calculation methodologies and sustainability reporting frameworks, things like SASB, TCFD, GRI, and so on. But also the sustainable management of suppliers and the tracking and reporting of ESG performance across your investment portfolio. So today we will be referencing our SupplierPortal solution predominantly in order to show you how this can aid the implementation of a successful supplier code of conduct program. And we'll look at an example of how one of our clients has used this to do so. So I think it's worth noting that we now have a very different relationship with our supply chain. There's now an expectation from all stakeholders, ranging from employees and customers through to investors, that businesses are accountable for their supply chain, the workers within them and their environmental impact. Failure to demonstrate a minimum, a robust supplier due diligence and engagement process can make the difference between obtaining a new client or investor and the failure to do so. So I think we're now operating in an environment where businesses are required to take responsibility for their entire supply chain, and in particular their upstream supply chain, so their whole value chain, but in particular their upstream supply chain. And this requirement to engage and manage and understand your suppliers is driven by a number of things. Fundamentally, the supply chain is increasingly becoming a compliance issue for businesses, with legislation being brought in to tackle complex issues such as slavery and trafficking, climate change and data protection. But there should be a recognition that the supply chain is an area of huge opportunity as well. And it's often the area for businesses where they can make their biggest positive impact. And that can be from reductions in Scope 3 emissions to improving the workplace and living conditions for people around the world. So it's in this context that we've got a renewed focus on supplier codes of conduct, and it's what Rachel introduced us to earlier. And it's in this context that we will view them today. So briefly, why is the code of conduct important? I'm not going to dwell on this because Rachel covered this in a little bit of detail just now, but it does illustrate what is at stake for an organization and what you're trying to achieve in successfully implementing a code of conduct. So at one end of the spectrum, we have the need to achieve compliance and mitigate the liability to your own organization. But this is limited in its potential to drive change. And it's also limited by the scope and frequency of new regulation and legislation. One of the key things you're looking at or trying to achieve through a code of conduct is improvement in your supply chain performance. And this is most effectively done through transparency of information and collaboration between you and your suppliers. So a supplier code of conduct can engender these new ways of working and hopefully form the basis of improvement and of an identification of new opportunities with suppliers. So creating a robust code of conduct is undoubtedly a challenge, but once you've created the document itself, there are significant challenges to overcome in order to make the supplier code of conduct effective to achieve its goal. So firstly, actually getting it to suppliers, how should you distribute it and in what format? Should that be offline? Should that be online? Those sorts of questions. And when should you distribute it? So during the tender process to all your potential suppliers, if that's the process you're going through, as part of the contractual process, perhaps, and then how frequently should suppliers refresh their responses to your code of conduct? All questions that need to be answered and solved. Once you have distributed it, how do you then manage or monitor supplier responses and identify non-compliances or opportunities for collaboration, for example? Then how do you engage suppliers in a proactive dialogue to ensure that you reach the desired outcome? So that should be hopefully reducing any risk and improving those suppliers' performances, so working together on that. Also, the code of conduct will undoubtedly evolve with your journey, with your company's corporate sustainability journey. So you need to understand how to incorporate this change in the process. So over time, those requirements that you place on suppliers and those requirements that are being placed on you as an organization evolve, and that's natural. And then lastly, how do you demonstrate externally that you've achieved the desired coverage of the code of conduct, that you've reviewed the responses, and that you've achieved the outcomes that you set out to achieve? So I think, and I'm sure there's more as well, but there's plenty of challenges there, but they're not insurmountable. And what we'll look through now is just something, firstly, our supplier portal solution and how that specifically looks to enable or solve those challenges. And then we'll look at quickly the results of what that looks like in a client environment, what can be achieved. So firstly, distribution. Supplier Portal enables clients to distribute bespoke questionnaires to their suppliers. So these can cover any topic or compliance requirement that applies to a specific supplier relationship. And a key use of the solution of Supplier Portal for clients is to embed their own specific codes of conduct into the solution and to monitor supplier engagement against these codes of conduct, against the individual clauses on an ongoing basis. And that's key. I mean, this is not, we're moving or being required to move from the code of conduct being an assessment in a point of time to it being an ongoing evaluation of your suppliers. The code can then be translated into questionnaire format. So the idea there is that rather than going at a code level or a document level where people sign and agree to the general theme of the document, they're actually being asked to adhere and record their compliance at a more granular level with each clause of the code of conduct. The other thing to note is that the Code of Conduct is often sent to suppliers in conjunction with other requests for information. So this could be information security assessments for specific suppliers, commercial information requirements around bank details, insurance documentation, indemnity and liability insurances, for example, or indeed requests for Scope 3 carbon emission data. So there's all sorts of things that this can be combined with, and the overriding driver for that is to reduce the points of contact that you have with a supplier. If you're asking them in lots of different ways for lots of different pieces of information, then ultimately you're going to reduce the compliance with those requests. So there's no point distributing the Code of Conduct if you cannot monitor compliance with it. So this should exist at two levels. One, that the suppliers received and acknowledged the relevant documentation. You should have hopefully 100% coverage across the target suppliers and be able to demonstrate this. The second is to evaluate compliance with the clauses of the contract. So this is carried out in SupplierPortal in a number of ways, but through scorecards, exception reporting, so you can draw out all the information you need to, and through automated risk flagging functionality. So the result is that you can immediately see suppliers that are not compliant or have not agreed to key terms in your document, and then it will be automatically alerted to this. So when you're deploying a Code of Conduct at scale, you want to know who's engaged with it, and you want to know immediately who's triggered any potential risks in association with their responses. So as we discussed earlier, unless you have a commitment to monitoring, managing, and engaging suppliers on the Code of Conduct, then even the most well-crafted document will prove to be ineffective. So without being able to engage suppliers, there's no way to remedy non-compliance and to collaborate to improve performance, or indeed work together on shared goals that will benefit both of you. So within SupplierPortal, there's an inbuilt action functionality which enables you to create actions anywhere in the system to engage suppliers on anything that you need to. So this creates a way of conversing directly with the supplier and sharing documentation in order to close the action. And that could be, for example, you sharing best practice advice to create a certain policy in order to draw that supplier up to the level that you would hope them to be at. The risk management tool within the system automatically identifies those suppliers that have triggered risks and enables clients to distribute corrective action plans automatically to multiple suppliers at a time. So this is key to be able to focus on specific risk levels, so high, medium, or low, for example, or specific areas such as a Code of Conduct. As much with as with the implementation of a sustainability strategy, the starting point is very different with a Code of Conduct where you start from where you'll be in 2, 5, and 10 years' time. So I mentioned it earlier, you just need to be aware that this is an evolving process, an evolving document, and you need the tools in place that can allow you that flexibility to evolve your approach. So as your strategy evolves, as new legislation materializes, you need to be in a place to distribute that quickly and effectively to suppliers to ensure that there aren't any unseen risks in your supply network. Naturally, that can be facilitated in SupplierPortal. And then lastly, we talked about the sort of external demonstration of progress and compliance with the Code of Conduct. And one form of ongoing assessment is of course the audit, and this can support the Supplier Code of Conduct with on-site audits being carried out with a view to confirming all the policies and procedures that are covered within a Code of Conduct document are actually in place. But this is a form of assessment, but also hopefully, again, we're focusing on improving performance. So identifying an issue is only part of the process. The need to collaborate and solve this issue is the hard part. So SupplierPortal can support you through that auditing process and integrate with global auditing programs to pull results into the system if that is useful as well. So we've seen how the various aspects of the system can help to solve some of the challenges that organisations are faced with when implementing a code of conduct. But how does this work in practice, and what are the results when you look at a particular client example? So if we look at this particular example where the project was focused specifically on a supplier code of conduct program, in this example, the client was one of the world's largest banks, operating in over 80 countries. They had an ethical code of conduct in place for years, but wanted a better way to engage suppliers on this code of conduct, and they had a particular focus on high-risk geographies. And they suspected that that these posed an unknown risk to their business, and so they identified a list of high-risk suppliers, which is around 1,500 suppliers, that they wanted to engage across multiple geographies. I can't remember how many. And many of the challenges they faced, we've mentioned today already, in terms of distribution and engaging suppliers. But in particular, they wanted to also gather evidence documentation to support the supplier responses, and have an automated system for identifying which suppliers they needed to engage further with. And this was an evolution both in terms of the fact that we needed to review the code of conduct itself as a document, but also to go deeper into it to request more evidence from suppliers than was previously being requested. So the first stage was to review that document, which was outdated in terms of its scope and relevance. It was then uploaded into the system in a questionnaire format, so that again ensured that suppliers were no longer signing an entire document, but responding to each individual clause in the code of conduct, providing the evidence documentation to support their claims. And we mentioned the flagging system, so that tiered risk flagging system. Suppliers were then identified as high, medium, and low risk. This enabled the targeted distribution of corrective action plans in order to engage suppliers on particular risk categories, and where possible to remediate those risks. So what were the results? Well, the most surprising statistic for the bank was that 90% of suppliers triggered at least one risk, and this was around 1,500 suppliers engaged. So, I mean, this is particularly surprising, as this was ostensibly a code of conduct which they had all previously signed and agreed to. So there should be nothing surprising in the document itself. But I don't know, why was this the case? Well, I would suggest that breaking down the code of conduct into its constituent parts made it harder for suppliers just to agree with the general consensus of the document, as we've touched on already. Also, I think requesting the evidence documentation to support simple policy claims, for example, forces the supplier to acknowledge the true state of affairs. And lastly, I think as they can see that you're using or entering their information into a system that's being used by their customers to actively review the data, to actively engage with them, they're less likely to falsify any claims. So that's our take on it. But numerically, once these risks have been identified, within 4 weeks of that happening, 63% of those risks have been remediated, and that's either being closed or being accepted that you're happy to work with that risk. And 82% of suppliers have been engaged in dialogue on those risks that have been triggered. So a lot of work was then happening on those specific issues. And then by the end of the project, 78% of risks were remediated and 12 suppliers were deselected. So on an ongoing basis, they then had a system in place to continue this work and processes in place to do that. So hopefully that's provided some insight into how we enable supplier codes of conduct and the results that can be achieved. I'll now pass you over to Colleen to look at the legislative side from a buyer and supplier perspective. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So I was effusively thanking both Gyles and Rachel for their interesting presentations, and particularly for taking part in this collaboration in the webinar, delivering the webinar today, but particularly working with Rachel over the last year, and Hannah and Parker, who put a lot of effort into this development of the white paper. So I think I haven't got a lot of time. There are just a few things that I might pull out today from what I had previously prepared for the for this presentation. I don't need to go through who I am. I just briefly wanted to tell you, if you haven't met or know about Ardea International previously, we are a specialist sustainability, business and human rights consultancy with expertise in modern slavery. We've partnered with Greenstone for a number of years, just trying to bring our expertise to our client base, and how the two things that we do kind of knit together. And we do work internationally, and this is just a snapshot of some of our clients. So I won't go into covering what Rachel had said before, just that it was a really interesting project that we did. Part of the thoughts behind this was that I had always actually been interested in the role of codes of conduct, having seen them being used in very different ways by different businesses across the last 10 years. And I think we specifically wanted to look at some of the questions around transparency and accountability, whether they had any impact, what their value was, but also to bring together some, I guess, some guidelines for businesses that haven't perhaps got a code or are thinking about updating or reviewing the code. So there's some really practical elements to the white paper. Just very briefly touching on COVID, I think what I've seen in the past year has been really interesting, talking about business and resilience, and you know, the impact of what we've seen the pandemic has had on businesses and their models. And obviously what we've seen globally is that there's been such a highlight of those people who are particularly vulnerable in supply chains, and particularly businesses that have dealt well with their supply chains and those that haven't. And I feel like it's been like a bit of a sifting, because the companies that haven't really thought about their real impact on the people in their supply chains, I suspect are going to have some difficulty in the years ahead, whereas those that are really seeking to be transparent, and, you know, going back to what Rachel had said about businesses actually being accountable to, are the ones that we're seeing are taking, you know, more interest in how they actually ensure that the policies that they have are robust, and that the procedures that sit behind those are also really good. I think Rachel has touched on the uses of a code of conduct, and obviously Gyles has shown us different ways that can be used within a business. I think that there are just a few things that I wanted to pull out a little bit further from what has been said. I think one issue or one aspect of the use of a code of conduct is that it can be viewed as a governance document. We see that it holds together the values of a company, and it enhances transparency. Many codes of conduct actually have standards that overlap with national regulation, and I think that's one point that is particularly interesting. I'll come back to the use of contract in a minute, but where you see in codes addressing things like modern slavery and forced labor and environmental issues, they will often tend to reflect the national legal standards concerning either human rights or the environment as a minimum, and set out almost mirror the way that companies are being regulated within their own industry. Now, that in itself is also interesting when we look at how it is utilized, and I'll come to that in a minute as well as the code of conduct and contractual point. The white paper sets out some examples of what is included in a code of conduct. What is quite interesting around this is that actually, whilst you see different things being included in a code of conduct, and that you obviously expecting suppliers to sign up to, we don't see in some codes that have been looked at that the exact expectation around regulations is set out in supply chains. And I think it was both Hannah and Parker that made a comment around that they felt that, you know, that was almost an opportunity missed, that, you know, actually the participants who had direct responsibility over their supply chains were not setting these kind of standards, and it was an opportunity that was missed by the businesses. Just to reflect a little bit around best practice for codes of conduct, I think that whilst we talk often about ensuring senior buy-in, I don't think that we can underestimate the importance of that. It's really important that we have buy-in from the top for the development of any policies that are relating to human rights and environment, because when you have that buy-in, you start having a reflection of an organization's culture. Codes of conduct should really focus on values and not the law. It should articulate a leadership commitment. A code, if it is also reflecting something that is reflecting values of integration and innovation in a business, should encourage employees to speak up and encourage them to report misconduct. Another thing that I just wanted to pull out around codes of conduct, and just I guess at this point to also reiterate what Rachel had said, we've been looking at supplier codes of conduct and not just codes of conduct that are set up for business employees. But it is really critical that you write it in a way that it's understandable for the people that it applies. And I've seen lots of examples of this. You know, a recent one that I reviewed for a business was talking very specifically about certain kinds of training or things that were available by certain organizations in the UK. But if you were going to read that as an Asian stakeholder or supplier, you would have no idea what they were referring to. And the same around a number of other aspects within that particular code of conduct. So I just want to reiterate that it's, you know, important that it's understandable and written so that everybody else can understand it, who's the audiences, I mean, not the audience, the suppliers who are signing up to it. The point that I made about the fact that codes of conduct have real value by incorporating and embedding minimum standards, and sometimes will reflect also the requirements of the law internally, is important for the reason that we are seeing a huge development in mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation. The legislation, the European Union has indicated that next year we are going to have mandatory human rights due diligence. And at the moment, there is a discussion in the UK around deforestation as a mandatory due diligence requirement. Why this is relevant in relation to codes of conduct is that a code of conduct will form part of your due diligence framework. So it's essential that one should have one in place, is the first instance. And the second reason I think is also important is that if you go back to domestic legislation like the Modern Slavery Act, companies are having to report on the steps that they are taking to combat modern slavery risk, and of course having a code of conduct in place that is properly monitored and effective is critical to being able to report on that. So on the issue of non-conformance and enforcement, I said I'd come back to the point about contracts and how many businesses are including a reference to a code of conduct as part of their terms and conditions of contract. Now, the reason that they are doing that is that, you know, often or primarily a code of conduct is used as Rachel said, it's a non-legally binding tool and it's self-regulatory. But increasingly, companies have had to think about, well, you know, what is the value of this if you don't monitor it or you don't enforce it? And as a means of kind of making these codes harder or incorporating them into hard law, they are being incorporated into codes of into contracts, which means that you are then relying on contract law to enforce them. There isn't a lot of evidence around, published evidence around examples of this and how, enforcement is taking place around contractual side of things, except to say that, I think there's a maturity also developing around how you monitor codes of conduct and what you do if you come to a point where there is a breach. If you have a contractual obligation that says, as you know, a minimum default, you've breached your code and therefore you're going to stop the contract, that I think has to be considered alongside the view that actually increasingly companies are taking a stance that you shouldn't just cut ties with a particular supplier, but that you should come alongside them and try and figure out what the issue is and then work with them to try and improve. That doesn't mean to say that you would accept any anything that is wrong with your code or any breach of your code. It does just mean that you have a sensible system in place to deal with particular breaches. To actually also have effective enforcement with a code, I think we've discussed this and it's been picked up by Gyles and Rachel as well, is that there needs to really be good stakeholder engagement. That means for a business understanding, who your suppliers are, how you engage with them, what is the most effective means of engaging with them. I'm often surprised with how many businesses don't ask that question, because in some instances you might actually want to have a conversation with some of your key suppliers and discuss some of these issues before possibly, making or ramping it up to including it into your terms and conditions of contract, or thinking of other ways that you might be dealing with breach. In some instances, that's going to not be possible at all, and possibly the best way that you're going to deal with it is in a similar format as Greenstone has, which is having a dashboard, having a questionnaire that's rolled out to thousands of suppliers, where you have a software option of actually monitoring the enforcement. I'm really conscious that there's only about 5 minutes left, if I'm right, and I don't want I want to give everyone an opportunity for some questions. So I guess the only other points I wanted to pick up on was around accountability and transparency. It is critical that if you develop a code of conduct, as I said before, that it is actually got the buy-in of senior leadership. It's critical to get feedback from an organization. I mean, it is interesting to say that to look within the research that was done, is that actually a number of participants stated that their code of conduct they felt was clear and easy to understand, and that the values that set out match their work experience, which is incredibly encouraging. It means it is the codes that are being looked at are accountable and transparent. I made the point that they need to be publicly accessible. Again, thinking about how codes are written, what is clear, what isn't clear, and how you actually manage that. I'm going to stop there. I'm sorry, it was a real sort of canter through a lot of different aspects. Hopefully, I've picked up on some points for you to think about around your monitoring and your enforcement of the code, sort of sitting alongside what Gyles has spoken about and Rachel. If you haven't downloaded the white paper, please do. We'd love to hear from you. Give us some feedback. You have my contact details, or you can go through the Ardea website. We'd love to have your feedback on what has been written. So thank you. I'll stop right there. Thanks.
Thank you, Colleen, Rachel, and Gyles. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. So we've got about 8 minutes, so I'll fire away with those. The first one is, what might be the specific challenges for implementing codes of conduct in the post-COVID recovery? I think that might be best placed for you, Rachel. See if we can get the webcam on.
I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why we want to bid for further research, because I I attended a webinar recently with that was sort of led by Mike Barry, the Marks and Spencer's Plan A architect, and I think this is a general concern amongst sustainability people, that with the prioritisation of economic recovery, there will be a slippage of expectations and monitoring for some of the issues in the codes. And my own view is I think we need quite urgent research on that to look at what actually is happening. So we'd be very interested in any of the audience here who would be interested in participating in research like that, because it will be much needed. I think Mike Barry, just to finish, was ending up saying, we know 80% of your effort will be devoted to economic recovery, but please devote 10 to 20% of your effort to sustainability.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that there, Rachel. The only point I would add from a just an engagement perspective rather than anything else is that the evidence that we've seen from trying to engage with suppliers during this period is that there's been a drop-off, and that's natural. There's been a lot of people around the world on furlough, more people laid off, and companies really struggling. So I think what it illustrates is that moving forward, you need to have the lines of communication already open with suppliers. You need to be already having those processes in place, irrespective of what it is you're communicating on. It might not be, as you say, so focused on every element of the code of conduct, Rachel, but you need to be talking to your suppliers on all aspects of your relationship.
You're on mute, Colleen.
Sorry. No, just an interesting point, sort of tying in what Gyles had just said. One thing that I found interesting recently with some of the people I've been working with, or the companies, is that actually what they're also picking up on is, by having those conversations, is that whilst perhaps they have been looking at things like quality control, that's when they've also noticed that there are other issues, because the quality control has been dropping off. For example, some of the places where things have been sourced from, the workers are not returning back, or they can't go back because of COVID, and so the quality is then diminishing. But then that's starting to uncover other issues around you know, those particular factories. I just wonder whether Hannah or Parker wanted to come in on any of those points.
Hi, Colleen. I don't know if you can hear me. I think Parker's having trouble with her internet. But yeah, I mean, I think all of the things, I agree. I don't necessarily have a lot to add to all the things that you were saying, but one of the things that we did talk about that, Colleen, you shared in the research over and over, was giving good examples of what implementation looks like. So not just referring to policy, but in this context, when the economy changes, when the market changes, what are examples that we can provide suppliers of what compliance looks like under these types of circumstances? So.
Thank you, Hannah.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. We have another question. Should a supplier code of conduct be different to a code of conduct?
Do you want me to take that? Or Rachel? Okay, I'd like Rachel to come in. It's an interesting question, because some organizations will just have a code of conduct which they use across the line. I would say you need to have two. One, you know, a code of conduct that is set for a business will set out how you expect your employees to behave, and there might be some very particular aspects of that you would require sort of tied back again to your company values. But a supplier code of conduct, if you think about what we've been saying, talks about engagement and different expectations. I think one of the things I didn't mention, but what I've seen in a lot of research, very interesting, is that setting standards for suppliers, particularly in countries where the rule of law is very weak, or the environmental and human rights standards are very poor, is often seen as quite critical by buyers. So I think a supplier code of conduct has a different, it is often nuanced in a different way, because it is expressed and engaged with suppliers in a different way to how you do a code of conduct. I don't know if Rachel, you've got, or Hannah, want to comment on that.
No, I think you summed that up perfectly. I think if you just have a code of conduct, then it means that that's fine. It'll be embodying values for your employees, but there's a lot of additional thinking that needs to happen if you're going to look at properly implementing and monitoring codes of conduct with your suppliers, that is different from managing within your own organizational boundaries. It's about once you cross your organizational boundaries, the issues change and there's a lot more to manage. And that's why for many, they will develop a separate supplementary supplier codes of conduct for their business.
Okay, thank you very much. Just conscious of time, I think we've got time for one more. You talked about risks being remediated in the bank case study. Was there any evidence of opportunity being identified with suppliers? I think that's related to your case study, Gyles.
Yes, absolutely. Well, yeah, we did focus on risk. In that particular example, I believe within the code of conduct they had a question around the circular economy, and requesting suggestions from suppliers on where they could work together to create a more circular relationship with them and the suppliers. I think last I heard, there was a couple of conversations that had come out of that. I don't know if anything concrete had come out of that, but yeah, in that particular instance, that was something that arose. Yeah, I don't know if in terms of content, Colleen or Rachel or Hannah, you came across any examples of where code of conduct stimulated positive outcomes.
Can you remember, Hannah? I can't remember offhand. What I have seen though is I am definitely seeing a shift in how businesses are looking at engaging with their suppliers around new supplier code of conduct. So we've seen in the last year a lot more organizations wanting to review their supplier code of conduct, and as part of that process, we've been helping look at, whether they meet International Labour Organization standards, what kind of international standards are actually embodied in those supplier code of conducts, and then specifically what it is that the business actually want, or the buyer actually wants suppliers to sign up to. So yeah, I would say that there's much more interest in reviewing them, much more interest in how you engage with your supplier to really get an understanding of how they will actually implement standards. I still think that the concepts around leverage are not possibly that well understood. I think there's a lot of work still to be done around working collaboratively with suppliers, where some suppliers find that they have 4 or 5 codes of conduct that they have to sign up to. I think we run out of time.
Yeah, I think we're out of time. So just thank you very much for all of the speakers today and all the hard work that's gone into the white paper. We'll be circulating the recording after this. And also, I think, Colleen, you'll be circulating the white paper as well, coinciding with its launch as well. So thank you, everybody, for attending, and thank you for the presenters.
No problem. Thanks very much. Take care, everyone.
Have a lovely, safe evening. Bye. Bye. Bye.